The morning of June 14th, 1944, dawned pale and metallic over Saipan Island, a volcanic strip of land barely wide enough to contain the ambitions of two empires. From a reinforced concrete bunker on the western coast, Admiral Nagumo watched the horizon through a pair of salt-fogged field glasses. Out beyond the reefs, gray silhouettes of American warships were forming hulking shadows in the mist, moving with a sense of inevitability. Nagumo had once commanded the carrier fleet that struck Pearl Harbor. Now he stood on the defensive, his career and his nation's fortunes reversed. Behind him, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito traced deployment lines across a wall map illuminated by a single lamp. 30,000 troops garrisoned Saipan. Artillery crowned its hills, pillboxes and caves turned the island into what Tokyo called an unsinkable fortress. The officer spoke quietly, almost ritualistically. "The Americans will come tomorrow," Nagumo murmured. "Let them," Saito replied. "They will bleed here until their democracy collapses." For months, Japanese planners had watched the U.S. advance across the Pacific with equal parts contempt and dread. The Americans' new method, island hopping, appeared to be an avoidance strategy. Bypass strongholds, seize lightly defended atolls, move ever closer to Japan. To Imperial staff, it looked like cowardice disguised as prudence. They misunderstood it completely. Tokyo's high command had spent 1,943 reinforcing outer perimeters, Rabaul, Truk Lagoon, and the Marshalls, only to find them isolated rather than assaulted. Each time, the U.S. Navy simply sailed past, cutting supply lines until the garrisons withered. Japanese intelligence concluded that Americans feared direct confrontation with well-prepared defenses. Thus, Saipan, a mere 1,500 miles from Tokyo, became the ultimate test of faith in that assumption. If the United States truly shunned costly battles, they would bypass Saipan. But if they dared attack it, Japan could destroy their will to fight. Either outcome, Tokyo believed, would serve the emperor's cause. What Japanese leaders could not yet perceive was that Washington's calculus had changed. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had become a test not of courage, but of industrial endurance. America's factories now produced aircraft, ships, and munitions faster than Japan could destroy them. The island-hopping campaign wasn't cowardice, it was ruthless efficiency. And Saipan, situated perfectly for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike Tokyo, was an objective no strategist could ignore. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz looked across the same waters where Nagumo had once triumphed. From those offices scarred by history, he orchestrated a counteroffensive of unprecedented scale, Operation Forager. The plan united Navy, Marine Corps, and Army forces under a single purpose: to seize the Marianas Chain and bring Japan within bomber range. Behind that sterile name lay a logistical miracle. 535 ships, 127,000 men, and a floating city of fuel, food, and ammunition gathered like a storm on the horizon. The invasion of Saipan would commence June 15th, 9 days after D-Day in Normandy. The Pacific and European theaters were now synchronized in a global rhythm of total war. Yet even with the staggering power assembled, American commanders understood what awaited them. Aerial reconnaissance revealed cave-fortified hills and artillery hidden on reverse slopes. The enemy would contest every beach and die in place. Intelligence estimated 15,000 defenders. In truth, the number was double, but by then, numbers hardly mattered. For the US, Saipan wasn't optional, it was destiny. On June 11th, battleships that had once burned at Pearl Harbor returned fire with vengeful thunder. 15 ships loosed 165,000 shells in 3 days. Carrier aircraft raked the island in constant waves. Underwater demolition teams swam through moonlit surf, marking channels for the landing craft to come.
All clear. Move
It
up.
was preparation on a scale the Pacific had never seen. The sea shook with it. Still, the veterans of Tarawa and Guadalcanal knew bombardments only softened, never destroyed, a Japanese defense. In their cramped troop holds, men wrote letters home, stowed Bibles, smoked in silence. Some remembered Tarawa's beaches turned crimson in hours. Others thought of friends buried under coral sand. They understood that no amount of shells could make the first step onto an enemy beach safe. The Japanese defenders, too, prepared for annihilation. In dark tunnels carved through limestone, soldiers recited the Emperor's rescript and fixed bayonets. Each man was instructed to kill 7 Americans before dying a grim arithmetic of faith. They believed no democracy could endure the losses such fanatic defense would inflict. They were wrong, but they did not know it yet. As night fell on June 14th, Nagumo and Saito reviewed their maps one last time. To them, the outcome seemed predetermined by willpower. They saw the gathering fleet offshore as proof of American fear, the need for numbers to mask weakness. They could not grasp that the U.S. fleet's vastness was not fear, it was industrial inevitability. What the Japanese called spirit, the Americans called logistics. And in 1944, logistics ruled war. When dawn broke on June 15th, the horizon erupted with motion. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's order echoed across the radio net: land the landing force. 700 landing craft churned toward the beaches, red, green, blue, and yellow. Inside, Marines clutched rifles slick with sweat, staring at the volcanic ridges ahead. Battleships thundered again, flattening the shoreline just beyond their path. At 8:10 a.m., the first wave hit. Japanese gunners waited until the amphibious tractors reached the lagoon, then unleashed a wall of fire. Shells tore through the water, machine guns stitched the surf. Vehicles exploded, men leaped into churning waves, equipment scattered across blood-stained foam. It was like walking into hell, one Marine recalled later. By 9, roughly 8,000 Marines were ashore, pinned behind dunes and shattered palm trunks. The air reeked of cordite and burning oil. Chaplains crawled among the wounded. Medics worked knee-deep in surf. Commanders shouted orders that vanished in the din. Yet still, more waves came. By nightfall, 20,000 Americans held a fragile beachhead 6 miles wide. Casualties exceeded 2,000, but the invasion had succeeded. The Japanese had failed to drive them back into the sea. That night, General Saito launched his counterattack tanks and infantry, charging through smoke toward Chiran Kanoa. It was chaos. American bazooka teams and Shermans shredded the assault in minutes. At dawn, the beaches were littered with burning Type 97 seconds. Saipan had become a furnace consuming men and machines alike. For Japan, the War of Illusion had ended. The Americans were not retreating, they were multiplying. And the shadow that Nagumo saw that morning was not merely a fleet, it was the shape of Japan's approaching defeat. By the morning of June 17, 1944, the beaches of Saipan had transformed into a machine of war. Landing craft continued to disgorge men, tanks, and supplies in an endless procession. Bulldozers carved makeshift roads through blasted coral. The sand was scarred with craters, burned out LVTs, and the bodies of men who had died where they stood. Over 33,000 tons of material had already been unloaded, enough to feed, fuel, and arm an entire army. For the Japanese commanders watching from their mountain positions, the scale of the American advance was staggering. General Yoshitsugu Saito, his uniform now streaked with dust and sweat, stared at the growing sprawl of tents, artillery batteries, and supply dumps below. What he saw defied every expectation. The American invasion force wasn't withdrawing despite heavy casualties, it was expanding. Every hour brought more men, more firepower. What had begun as an amphibious assault was now a self-sustaining industrial ecosystem, operating thousands of miles from the U.S. mainland, yet functioning as if it were a city built overnight. It was the ultimate manifestation of what Japan's war planners had underestimated: the logistical genius of American warfare. The defenders' morale began to crack under the relentless bombardment. Artillery and naval guns pounded the island without rest, their shells whistling through the night sky like iron comets. One Japanese soldier wrote in his diary before being killed, "The ground shakes as if the island itself resists being Japanese. We fire back into the darkness, but the enemy does not stop coming." The failed counterattack of June 16th had destroyed the last functional Japanese tank regiment. Those who survived retreated into the hills, preparing for a final stand. Meanwhile, the American beachhead widened. Sherman tanks rolled inland, grinding over debris and corpses alike. Engineers established radio towers, ammunition dumps, and field hospitals. To those who had fought at Tarawa or Guadalcanal, this was the war's brutal logic kill zones turned into forward bases within days. American planners had prepared meticulously for such momentum. Behind the front lines, logisticians managed everything from fuel storage to rations. Each Marine carried almost 1 ton of supplies, from ammunition to medical kits. Naval convoys operated with the precision of a factory assembly line, replenishing the beaches faster than the Japanese could destroy them. In effect, the Pacific Ocean had become an American supply highway, and Saipan its newest terminal. Yet despite the overwhelming might, the battle was far from over. The Japanese garrison, over 30,000 strong, still occupied caves, ridges, and sugarcane fields. Every hill was fortified. Every ravine could hide machine guns. For the Marines pushing inland, it became a nightmare of attrition. A platoon might advance 100 yards, only to be pinned by fire from an unseen bunker. Grenades, flamethrowers, and demolition charges became the weapons of choice in a landscape that seemed to devour men whole. One correspondent described the combat as a war of yards, not miles, each gained through blood. Civilians, too, were trapped in the inferno. Thousands of Japanese settlers and indigenous Chamorro Islanders found themselves caught between the lines. Propaganda had convinced many that surrender meant torture or death. Mothers carried children into the hills. Entire families huddled in caves as the world outside burned. The Americans dropped leaflets promising safety, but few trusted them. Fear had done what propaganda was designed to do. It weaponized the human mind. By June 20th, the U.S. 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions linked up in the island's center, effectively splitting Japanese defenses in half. The 27th Infantry Division, a New York National Guard unit, pushed inland to secure the airfields. There, they faced the fiercest resistance yet. The fighting at Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge turned the lush interior into a graveyard. Artillery fire shook the earth. Japanese soldiers, often fighting to the death, emerged from spider holes at night to launch suicidal attacks. Entire squads were wiped out in hand-to-hand combat, illuminated only by tracer fire. Still, the American advance did not stop. Marine flamethrower teams turned cave mouths into tombs. Demolition units blasted ridge after ridge. A grim rhythm took hold: advance, encounter, resistance, annihilate, repeat. In Tokyo, news from Saipan was received with disbelief. Early reports had promised victory. Now, silence from the front suggested disaster. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had sworn the island would never fall, began to lose the confidence of his cabinet. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito received messages hinting that the war might no longer be winnable. Saipan was not just a battle, it was the moment Japan's leadership glimpsed the abyss. In the field, American commanders also understood the stakes. General Howland Mad Smith drove his men ruthlessly, unwilling to risk delay. He clashed with Army officers over tactics, even relieving commanders he deemed too cautious. His obsession was clear: momentum. To pause was to give the enemy time to regroup. And so, each day, Marines pressed forward under a canopy of naval artillery fire, while offshore, battleships and carriers maintained a constant barrage. By June 23rd, the Japanese situation was hopeless. Ammunition was nearly gone, food was scarce, and communication lines had collapsed. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Saito issued an order to his surviving troops: "We shall advance to attack the enemy and die an honorable death. Each man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying. Long live the Emperor." It was not a tactical directive, it was a funeral announcement for his army. On July 7th, as dawn broke over Saipan's smoking hills, thousands of Japanese soldiers wounded, starving, many without weapons charged in one last banzai assault. It was the largest suicidal attack of the Pacific War. They crashed through American lines, screaming battle cries, wielding swords, bayonets, and even sticks. The onslaught was terrifying, primal, and futile. Machine guns cut them down by the hundreds. Tanks rolled forward, firing point blank. When it ended, over 4,000 Japanese lay dead on the plain. General Saito, mortally wounded, committed suicide in his cave. Admiral Nagumo did the same. Their deaths marked not only the fall of Saipan, but the collapse of Japan's strategic illusion that spirit could defeat steel. For the Americans, victory had come at a brutal price. Over 14,000 casualties, with 3,426 dead. The beaches, the ridges, and the cane fields bore silent witness to the cost of progress. Yet among the exhausted Marines, a grim satisfaction lingered. They had captured the island that would bring Tokyo within reach of American bombers. The Battle of Saipan was over. The war, however, was entering its most decisive phase. From the smoking ruins of this island fortress, the skies over Japan would soon ignite. The fall of Saipan was more than a battlefield victory, it was a turning point that reshaped the very trajectory of the Pacific War. On July 9, 1944, when organized Japanese resistance officially ended, the island lay in ruins. Hills once covered in tropical vegetation were stripped bare by bombardment. Entire villages had vanished. The air reeked of gunpowder, decay, and burned fuel. But beneath the destruction, something larger had shifted: the balance of power in the Pacific. For the first time, American forces stood within striking distance of Japan's home islands. Airfields on Saipan could now host the new B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of its era, capable of carrying 5 tons of explosives across 3,000 miles. Within months, bombers would rise from these runways to deliver firestorms upon Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. The Japanese command understood the implications instantly. The Empire's defensive perimeter had been broken. In Tokyo, the reaction bordered on panic. The news of Saipan's loss reached the Imperial Palace like a thunderclap. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had assured the emperor that the island was impregnable, faced a political implosion. On July 18th, he resigned, his cabinet collapsing under the weight of military humiliation. For the Japanese public, the propaganda veil began to tear. The war that had once been portrayed as a series of divine victories was now revealed as a desperate struggle for survival. The emperor, previously sheltered from military realities, began to ask quiet but devastating questions. If Saipan has fallen, how can we defend the homeland? It was a question without an answer. For every Japanese general who still spoke of honor and death, there were now whispers among the palace advisors of an unthinkable word: surrender. Meanwhile, on Saipan itself, the human cost was staggering. Over 22,000 civilians perished, many in combat, others by suicide. Propaganda had convinced them that American soldiers would commit atrocities. Families gathered on the cliffs of Marpi Point today, known as Suicide Cliff, and leapt into the sea. Soldiers urged them on, unable to accept the shame of capture. Marines who reached the area later recalled the horror of seeing entire families lying intertwined at the base of the cliffs. One corporal wrote in disbelief, "We thought we had seen all that war could show us. We were wrong." It was the moment when propaganda met its cruel reckoning. The American troops, though hardened by combat, were not the monsters Tokyo had described. They gave food to survivors, treated the wounded, and buried the dead enemy and civilian alike. For many soldiers, this compassion amid devastation became the war's most haunting memory.
Look closely.
Strategically, Saipan's capture validated Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific strategy, a methodical advance through the heart of the Japanese defense line rather than around it. The success silenced critics who had favored General Douglas MacArthur's route through the Philippines and New Guinea. Saipan proved that overwhelming naval, air, and logistical superiority could conquer any island, no matter how fortified. It was a demonstration of industrialized warfare at its purest form, where machines, not just men, dictated destiny. Every American victory from that point forward would follow the same pattern: isolate, bombard, land, advance, annihilate. The Pacific became a chessboard of islands, each move bringing the U.S. closer to Japan's heart. But with each success came an unsettling realization: if Saipan's defenders had fought to the last man, what would happen when the Americans reached Japan itself? That question began to consume Allied planners. The casualty projections for a mainland invasion were staggering. Some estimates predicted over 1 million Allied losses. For many strategists, the atomic bomb project, then still in secret development, was partly justified by what had been witnessed on Saipan. The terrifying certainty that Japan would never surrender while it still had the means to resist. From November 1944 to August 1945, B-29 bombers operating from Saipan and neighboring Tinian and Guam launched over 25,000 sorties against Japan, dropping nearly 170,000 tons of bombs. The raids destroyed industrial centers, crippled transportation networks, and shattered public morale. Tokyo burned. Civilian casualties reached unimaginable levels. Yet in military headquarters, The reasoning was cold and mathematical. The destruction of Japan's industrial base would shorten the war and save American lives in the long run. Saipan's airfields thus became both the sword and the scale of modern warfare tools of devastation that weighed human cost against strategic necessity. Even after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, historians would trace the beginning of Japan's defeat back to this single island. Without Saipan, the U.S. would have had no forward base for sustained bombing. Without those bombings, Japan might have fought on for years. In this sense, Saipan was the quiet prelude to the end of the world's deadliest war. For the men who fought there, however, victory offered little peace. Survivors of the 2nd Marine Division spoke of nights haunted by explosions that no longer existed, of comrades lost in the smoke and confusion. Many carried the trauma for decades. "You never really left Saipan," one veteran said years later. "You just walked away from it." Among the Japanese survivors, the aftermath was even darker. Barely 3% of the garrison, around 900 men, were captured alive. They were emaciated, many maimed, all broken by the burden of survival in a culture that glorified death. For them, the shame of captivity would last a lifetime. When Japan surrendered a year later, some still wept not for defeat, but for the comrades who had chosen death over dishonor. 80 years later, Saipan remains both an American territory and a silent graveyard. Visitors walk along its beaches, unaware that beneath their feet lie fragments of helmets, dog tags, and bones. Rusted tanks still sit half buried in coral. The cliffs of Marpy Point stand unchanged, their wind carrying whispers of prayers spoken before the leap. The island's modern airport, once Islay Field, base of the 73rd Bomb Wing, receives tourists instead of bombers. Commercial planes land on the same runways that launched the raids which incinerated Tokyo. Each landing is an unwitting reenactment of history, peaceful descent upon a place built for war. Saipan's legacy endures not as a monument to victory, but as a lesson written in fire and blood, a reminder that in modern war, courage alone cannot triumph over industry, and faith cannot outlast logistics. The Battle of Saipan, in the end, was not simply a clash between armies. It was a confrontation between two civilizations and two philosophies of war. On one side stood Japan, a nation forged in the traditions of Bushido, where death was preferable to defeat, and where spiritual resolve was seen as the ultimate weapon. On the other stood the United States, a democracy that had industrialized its courage, turning factories, assembly lines, and logistics into the engines of modern warfare. When these forces met on that narrow island in June 1944, the result was inevitable, though the world did not yet know it. For Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and General Yoshitsugu Saito, the fall of Saipan was a personal reckoning. Nagumo, who had once commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, now witnessed his fleet's destruction mirrored on land. The fire that had once symbolized Japan's rise now consumed his final command post. Saito, wounded and exhausted, dictated his last message before taking his own life. "We have fulfilled our duty to the Emperor. The spirits of our comrades guard the Empire. May Japan live for 10,000 years. Moments later, he was gone. The men who had believed they could turn back history now joined it. Their defeat was not due to cowardice or incompetence. It was the collision of idealism with industrial reality. Japan's military code had been built for wars of attrition and personal valor, not for the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century. No matter how disciplined or fanatical its soldiers, Japan simply could not match a nation whose factories produced more steel in a week than Japan did in a month. whose shipyards launched new vessels faster than enemy submarines could sink them, and whose scientists were already engineering the next generation of warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, surveying the results from his flagship, understood what Saipan meant. The Marianas Campaign had not only given the U.S. a base for strategic bombing, it had cracked the psychological armor of Japan's military leadership. From now on, every Japanese commander knew the pattern: isolation, bombardment, landing, annihilation. The Empire's defensive line, once imagined as a wall of unbreakable islands, was now an open door. Within weeks of Saipan's fall, American forces struck Tinian and Guam, completing the conquest of the Marianas. Airfields expanded rapidly. In less than 2 months, engineers transformed coral plains into concrete runways, long enough for the massive B-29 seconds. The airfields bore the names of the fallen: Isley Field, North Field, West Field, silent memorials to those who had turned the tide. From these runways, a new kind of war was born, one fought not face to face, but from the stratosphere. The superfortresses flew at 30,000 feet, engines droning like thunder over the Pacific. Each carried more destructive power than an entire squadron of pre-war bombers. The raids that followed, first precision, then area bombing, would burn entire cities to ash. The line between soldier and civilian dissolved in the glare of firebombs. The Japanese command, desperate to defend the homeland, resorted to measures once unthinkable. The kamikaze program began soon after, born partly out of the despair that Saipan had unleashed. If industrial power could not be matched, perhaps spiritual sacrifice could balance the scales. Young pilots, many barely trained, took off on one-way missions. Their courage was unquestionable, but it was a courage expended in futility. Saipan had proven that sacrifice without strategy is suicide. In the United States, news of the victory brought both celebration and solemn reflection. Newspapers declared Saipan the doorway to Japan, but beneath the headlines, military analysts issued warnings. If 30,000 defenders on a small island could inflict such losses, how many lives would an invasion of Japan's main islands cost? The answer haunted every war planner in Washington. It was this grim arithmetic that later gave weight to the Manhattan Project's outcome. When President Harry Truman authorized the atomic bombings in August 1945, the justification was framed in the shadow of battles like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each had proven that Japan would fight to the death, and that each mile gained would require oceans of blood. Saipan, in many ways, was the first grim equation in that logic. If one island demanded 3,000 American dead, how many would the homeland demand? Yet, amid the destruction, Saipan also revealed glimpses of humanity that transcended the brutality. Marines shared water with captured Japanese children. Corpsmen treated wounded civilians who had once been their enemies. A photograph taken days after the battle shows a Marine kneeling beside a crying child, handing her a piece of chocolate from his ration pack. The image spread through newspapers across the U.S., a quiet symbol that compassion had survived even in hell. For many Japanese survivors, those small acts shattered years of indoctrination. They told us Americans were demons, recalled one woman decades later. But the man who gave my son medicine saved his life. He was not a demon. He was a man. That single realization, repeated thousands of times, was the first fragile bridge toward post-war reconciliation. In the decades that followed, Saipan became a place of memory rather than strategy.
The ultimate fate of
the jungles grew back.
was the pressing
Coral
question.
reclaimed rusted tanks. The cliffs where families had perished are now marked with monuments written in both English and Japanese. Visitors leave flowers and folded paper cranes. School children learn not of victory or defeat, but of the cost of believing any nation is invincible. Modern historians often describe Saipan as the fulcrum of the Pacific War,
What does this mean for us?
the battle that tipped momentum irreversibly
finally
toward
over?
the Allies.
I can't
But
believe it.
beyond strategy and logistics, it stands as a moral lesson. When nations deify war, war consumes them in return. Japan had sought honor through sacrifice. America sought victory through power. Both found something else, an understanding that total war leaves no victor untouched. For every city bombed, every island taken, the human cost deepened the world's hunger for peace. In the end, Saipan was the crossroads where the age of courage met the age of machines. It marked the moment when warfare ceased to be about territory and began to revolve around capacity, industrial, logistical, technological, psychological. The world that emerged from its ashes would never again fight the same way. When the first B-29 took off from Tinian's runway later that year, its shadow passed over Saipan's battered hills, the same ground where Nagumo and Saito had stood, convinced that courage alone could stop an empire. They had been wrong, but their tragedy was universal. They had mistaken valor for victory and willpower for wisdom. The lesson of Saipan endures for every nation that believes war can be mastered. The truth is simpler and more haunting: war masters everyone.